The entire family voted to leave the old mare in the far pasture to die alone. 22 years of loyalty, and not one of them would sit with her through the cold. But at 11 o'clock that first night, a bedroom window creaked open, and a 7-year-old girl dropped barefoot into the frozen grass. Every single night for the next 3 weeks, she made that same journey, and what the mare did in return the morning they came to bury her left every one of them unable to speak. This is Belle. For 22 years, she was the most dependable horse on the Mitchell family farm, carrying children to school, pulling the plow through spring mud, never once refusing a rider. But old age took her legs, and the winter feed bill broke their patience. The family council voted to leave her in the far field and let nature take its course. The only voice that cried out against it belonged to a 7-year-old girl named Lily, who wasn't old enough to have a vote. What Lily would witness over those 3 weeks would not only shatter her family's calculation of what a dying horse is worth, it would force every one of them to confront a question none of them were ready to answer. To understand what happened in that frozen pasture, you need to go back to the day Belle first arrived as a terrified yearling, and the unspoken promise that was made between a young girl and a horse who would become her whole world. The promise was sealed on a stifling July afternoon in 1999, the day Harold Mitchell limped through the farm gate with a scrawny yearling in tow. Belle had been a throwaway at the county auction, too flighty, too underfed, sold for $35 to a man the handlers warned would only waste his money. Harold was 71 then, his hands knotted with arthritis, his heart still raw from burying his wife Margaret the year before. But when he saw the trembling filly with the white star on her forehead, something in him refused to walk away. He brought her home as a gift for his 12-year-old son Tom. Hopping the horse might teach the boy the patience Harold feared the modern world was erasing. For the first 3 summers, it worked. Tom spent every free hour in the saddle, learning the rise and fall of Belle's breathing, discovering that a horse's trust is not demanded, but earned in increments of quiet presence. Then adolescence arrived, and with it, the predictable drift toward trucks, girls, and the conviction that a farm was a prison. Belle became a background fixture, a tool for pulling fence posts when no tractor was handy, a relic of a boyhood Tom no longer wanted to remember. But a horse's memory is longer than a decade, and Belle was waiting when the next Mitchell arrived. Lily was born during a freak April snowstorm in 2014, the 3rd child and only daughter of Tom and his wife Claire. From the moment she could walk, the girl was drawn to the barn like a compass needle seeking true north. By the age of 3, she was slipping through the fence rails before anyone could stop her, settling into the straw beside Belle's massive body with the casual fearlessness of a child who had not yet learned that the world could hurt her. Belle, who had grown old and distant with the adults, would lower her gray muzzle and breathe warm air into Lily's hair. The horse who spooked at slammed doors and raised voices stood motionless for the toddler who could not yet pronounce her own name. Neighbors called it cute. Claire called it unnerving. But the old veterinarian, Dr. Chen, the same woman who had treated Harold's horses decades earlier, saw something deeper. She told Tom that the bond between a child and a dying animal is not sentimental. It is biological. It rewires the brain. You need to understand how inseparable they became, because that is the only way to measure what happened next. By the time Lily was 7, she had learned to read by sounding out words to Belle in the stall. She had learned to grieve when the family's old dog died, burying her face in Belle's mane and soaking it with tears. She had extracted from her father a solemn vow that Belle would live out her days in green pasture, never in a stranger's trailer, never in a slaughter line. Tom gave that promise easily, because promises cost only breath when the future is invisible. He did not yet know that the farm was bleeding money. He did not yet know that winter hay prices would spike to levels the family books could not absorb, that a series of drought summers had already hollowed out the savings that the bank was circling. And he certainly did not know that his two older sons, Michael and Jacob, now teenagers with the hard pragmatism of young men who have watched their father fail, would be the ones to force the conversation. It happened on a Thursday evening in mid-January, the temperature dropping toward 14 degrees, the kitchen table littered with unpaid invoices. Claire spread the numbers out like evidence at a trial. The old mare was consuming $400 a month in feed and supplements. Her back legs were failing. Dr. Chen had gently suggested that the kindest option might be letting her go before the cold finished what arthritis had started. Tom stared at the papers, his jaw working. Michael spoke first. "Dad, she can't even stand without help. It's time." Jacob nodded, avoiding his little sister's empty chair. Lily was already in bed. The family vote took less than 3 minutes. Belle would be moved the next morning to the far field, where the old shelter had collapsed years ago and the water froze by dusk. No veterinary euthanasia, that cost too much, and Tom's version of mercy had curdled into a grim frontier logic. They would leave her with a single bale of hay and let nature solve the problem. Tom convinced himself it was what his father Harold would have done. Never mind that Harold had once spent his last $40 to save a dying mare nobody wanted. Lily was not asleep. She was pressed against the heating vent in her bedroom floor, and she heard every word. When the kitchen fell silent, she crawled back to her bed and sat in the dark, replaying her father's voice over and over. The man who had taught her that a promise was unbreakable had just broken the most important one she had ever asked him to make. And then she looked at the window, at the frost spreading across the glass, and she pictured Belle standing alone in a field where the wind cut like a blade. She could not imagine a world in which she stayed inside while that horse trembled in the dark. So she reached for her coat. She did not use the front door. The hinges would betray her. Instead, Lily unlatched the window above her bed, the one that had been painted shut years ago, but that she had learned to jimmy open with a butter knife she kept under her pillow. The cold hit her face like a slap of glass, but she did not flinch. She dropped the 4 feet to the frozen ground, her sneakers crunching into the crust of old snow, and she ran. Not toward the road, not toward any hiding place a child might seek, but straight across the empty pasture, past the darkened barn, toward the far field where the old shelter had collapsed 2 winters ago, and where Belle now stood alone in the thick January darkness. The distance was half a mile. For a 7-year-old in 14 degrees, it might as well have been an Arctic crossing. But Lily had spent her life studying this land, memorizing every dip and rock, and she navigated by the thin moonlight reflecting off the snow. When she reached the far field, she found Belle exactly where she feared, standing with her head low, already shivering, her breath coming in shallow white puffs that vanished into the indifferent air. The single bale of hay her father had left sat untouched. Belle was too weak to pull from it, too arthritic to lower her neck far enough. The family had not even bothered to cut the twine. Lily understood in that moment, with a clarity that no child should possess, that the abandonment was not just cruel. It was designed to fail. She spent that first night huddled against Belle's side, her small body pressed into the hollow behind the mare's shoulder, where the wind could not reach. Belle, who had stood motionless and despondent for hours, gradually shifted her weight and curved her great neck around the child. The horse, who could barely walk, had found the strength to shelter a girl half her height. When the first grey light of dawn appeared, Lily kissed Belle's muzzle and ran back to the house, slipping through her window just before her mother's alarm clock rang. She was in her bed when Claire opened the door, cheeks still flushed, boots hidden under the mattress, the smell of horse and hay clinging to her hair like a secret. That was only the first night. And here is where the story takes its first impossible turn, because Lily did not stop. The next evening, she went again. This time she brought a butter knife and cut the twine on the hay bale before she settled in. The night after that, she brought an old wool blanket from the attic trunk, the one her grandmother Margaret had knitted decades ago, and draped it over Belle's swaying back. She talked to the mare for hours, telling her about school, about the boy who pulled her hair, about the dream she had of flying over the pasture on Belle's back. And each morning she returned before dawn, her absence unnoticed, her secret held in the space between a child's courage and a family's blindness. But secrets have a rhythm, and someone was beginning to hear it. Michael, Lily's older brother, had always been a light sleeper. On the fourth night, he woke to the sound of a window sliding and looked out to see a small figure crossing the yard. He assumed it was a dream. On the fifth night, he stayed awake intentionally and saw it again. He told Jacob, but Jacob dismissed it as their little sister chasing raccoons. It would take something far more dramatic to break through the family's denial, and that something was already gathering in the weather patterns moving across the plains. The revelation chain accelerated on the 11th night. A hard freeze descended, the kind that cracks pipes and kills livestock if they are not sheltered. Tom, who had been burying his guilt under layers of stubborn silence, could not sleep. He walked to the kitchen for water and noticed the back door was ajar, the door no one ever used. He stepped outside and saw fresh tracks in the snow, child-sized, leading away from the house. His first thought was panic. His second was a cold recognition that he had been lied to, not by an enemy, but by his own conscience. He followed the tracks, and when he reached the far field, he stopped as if struck. The scene before him would have broken a harder man. Belle was lying in the snow, but not dead, not abandoned. She was curled around Lily, whose small body was tucked into the curve of the mare's belly, both of them covered in the old wool blanket. A small glass jar sat nearby. Lily had brought a candle encased in a mason jar for warmth, and its faint flame still flickered. The horse's breathing was labored but steady. The child was asleep, one hand resting on Belle's muzzle. It was the picture of a vigil, and Tom understood then that while he had been calculating hay costs, his daughter had been paying a far greater price, and had done so without once asking for permission. He did not wake her. He did not drag her back to the house and lock the window. He simply stood there, his breath clouding in the frigid air, and felt the architecture of his justifications collapse. His sons had argued that the mare was suffering and the family could not afford mercy. But Lily had proved that mercy costs nothing except presence, and she had given it every night while the adults slept. The father who had taught his children that a Mitchell never breaks a promise was now staring at the evidence that his own promise had been kept by the smallest hands in the house. But this was not the pivot yet. The pivot came 2 nights later, on the 13th visit, when Lily arrived to find Belle standing again. Not just standing, walking. Slowly, painfully, but moving toward the child, as if her legs had discovered a reserve of strength no veterinarian would have predicted. And when Lily held up her hand, Belle pressed her forehead into the girl's palm and released a sound that was not a whinny. It was a deep, rumbling exhale, a horse's version of a sigh, and in that sound was a surrender that had nothing to do with death. It was as if the mare had been waiting for someone to acknowledge that her life still mattered, and once that acknowledgement came, she was willing to fight for it. This changed everything. Because if Belle could rally when given a reason, Then the family's logic, that she was too far gone to save, was not just wrong. It was a lie they had told themselves to justify an unthinkable cruelty. Lily did not understand the science. She only knew that her friend was not ready to leave her. And so on the 14th night, she brought a small bag of grain she had smuggled from the feed room, and on the 15th, a heated water bottle she had filled from the kitchen tap, and on the 16th, a second blanket. She was no longer hiding her supplies as carefully because, in the back of her mind, she was beginning to believe that if her family discovered her, they would have to help, or they would have to stop her, and she was not sure they had the courage. The storm that finally forced the reckoning arrived on day 20, a blizzard that swept down from the north and buried the farm in 2 feet of snow within 6 hours. The power flickered and died. The family gathered in the living room around the wood stove, and it was only when Claire did a head count that she realized Lily was not there. The window in her room was wide open, snow piling on the sill. Tom did not hesitate this time. He pulled on his coat, grabbed the heavy flashlight, and shouted for his sons to come with him. The 3 of them plunged into the white fury, following tracks that were already disappearing, and when they reached the far field, they found Lily dragging a tarp toward the collapsed shelter, trying to create a windbreak for a horse that was now too weak to rise. She was crying, but not from fear. She was crying because Belle had finally laid down and had not gotten up. The mare's eyes were open, still tracking Lily's movements, but the breathing was shallow and slow. Tom dropped to his knees in the snow beside his daughter. Michael and Jacob, the 2 boys who had voted to leave the horse to die, stood frozen. And it was Jacob, the younger brother, the one who had always been more sensitive than he showed, who spoke first. "We have to get her to the barn," he said. Now, the words hung in the air like a verdict. But the barn was half a mile away, and Belle could not walk. That left only one option. They would have to carry her, or they would have to let her die in the snow. And the sun was not coming up for another 8 hours. They had no sled, no tractor, no time. The snow was falling so thick that the beam of Tom's flashlight carved only a few feet of visibility. Michael and Jacob dropped to their knees beside their father, and together the 3 of them heaved Belle's massive body onto the tarp Lily had been trying to rig as a windbreak. The mare weighed over 1,000 pounds, and every inch of ground they gained cost them breath and muscle and the burning surrender of pride. Lily walked alongside, one hand buried in Belle's mane, talking in a low, steady murmur that none of them could quite hear. She was not speaking to them. She was speaking to the horse, and in those whispered syllables was the accumulated intimacy of 20 nights in the cold, the private language that had grown in the dark between a child and a dying animal. Belle's eyes, which had been glassy and unfocused, blinked slowly and tracked Lily's voice as if it were a rope pulling her back from some distant shore. The half-mile journey took over an hour. By the time they reached the barn doors, Tom's hands were bleeding inside his gloves, and Jacob had tears frozen on his cheeks, not from the cold, but from the dawning understanding of what they had done. They pulled Belle through the wide entrance and into the same stall where she had spent her first night as a yearling, the same stall where a 12-year-old Tom had once brushed her coat every Sunday. The irony was not lost on him. The horse they had sentenced to die in the elements was now lying on fresh straw in the place they should have kept her all along. Claire arrived moments later, having discovered the family missing and followed the chaos of tracks through the storm. She stood in the barn doorway, a lantern in her hand, and looked at the scene, her husband and sons gasping, her daughter curled against a collapsed horse, the blood and the straw and the weight of everything unspoken. Dr. Chen received the call at 2 in the morning. She was 67 years old, retired in name only, and she did not hesitate. She loaded her truck with supplies and drove through the blizzard at 15 miles per hour, her knuckles white on the wheel, knowing that whatever waited at the Mitchell farm was either a tragedy or a miracle, and that she would not know which until she walked through the barn door. When she arrived, she took one look at Belle's distended abdomen, at the way the mare's breathing had shifted from shallow to rhythmic, and her face went pale. She asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. How long has she been like this? Tom started to explain about the field, the cold, the 20 nights, but Dr. Chen cut him off with a raised hand. She was not asking about the neglect. She was asking about the pregnancy. The word landed like a physical blow. Tom stared at the veterinarian, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Claire let out a small, choked noise. Lily, who was still pressed against Belle's side, looked up with wide eyes. Dr. Chen repeated herself, her voice tight with controlled urgency. Belle was pregnant. She had been pregnant for months, probably since late summer, before the family had started discussing putting her down. The weight loss, the lethargy, the difficulty standing, all of it had been misread as old age, when it was actually the toll of carrying a foal without enough nutrition. The Mitchells had been calculating the cost of euthanizing a horse that was not merely old. She was creating life, and they had left her in a field to starve, two hearts beating inside one failing body. Here is the moment where the story splits, where the narrative that had been building toward a quiet, tragic death suddenly becomes something else entirely. Dr. Chen knelt in the straw and pressed her stethoscope to Belle's belly. The barn went silent. Even Lily held her breath. And then the veterinarian looked up, and there was something in her expression that was not grief or anger, but a raw, unguarded astonishment. The foal was still alive. After 3 weeks of freezing nights, after malnutrition and abandonment, the unborn horse inside Belle was still fighting. And not only that, Dr. Chen, her voice cracking, added something that sent a shudder through every person standing in that barn. Belle was in labor. Right now, the labor was not progressing naturally. Belle's body, depleted by weeks of cold and hunger, could not summon the contractions necessary to deliver the foal on its own. Dr. Chen began working with the same desperate precision that had marked her entire career, her hands moving inside the mare while she instructed Michael and Jacob to position themselves at Belle's head to keep her calm. Tom stood uselessly, a man who had once considered himself capable of solving any problem on his farm, now reduced to a spectator as the consequences of his choices unfolded before him. And Lily, 7-year-old Lily, who had not slept more than a few hours in 3 weeks, who had carried blankets and candles and grain across half a mile of frozen darkness. Lily climbed into the stall and sat in the straw beside Belle's head, her small voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that stilled the room. She told Belle that she was not allowed to give up. She told her that there was a baby coming and that mothers did not leave their Barbies, and that she had not spent 20 nights in the cold just to watch Belle quit now. She spoke with a ferocity that did not belong to a child, a conviction borrowed from some deeper well. And Belle, whose eyes had been rolling with pain and fear, focused on Lily's face and held there. The mare's breathing steadied. Her body, against every medical expectation, began to work with Dr. Chen instead of against her. 20 minutes later, 20 minutes that felt like a lifetime to the family watching, the first glistening hoof emerged. Then a muzzle. Then, with a final, shuddering effort from Belle, the entire foal slid onto the straw in a rush of fluid and membrane. It was a filly. Small, impossibly fragile, her coat a dark bay with a white star blazing on her forehead exactly like her mother's. She did not move. She did not breathe. Dr. Chen tore open the birth sac and began rubbing the tiny body with a towel, her movements urgent but controlled. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." The seconds stretched. Michael turned away, unable to watch. Jacob buried his face in his hands. Tom stood frozen, his mind replaying the kitchen meeting, the vote, the bale of hay with the twine still tied. And Lily, still seated in the straw, reached out and laid her hand on the foal's wet shoulder. "Your mama waited for you," she said. "You have to wait for her too," the filly gasped. Her chest rose and fell in a shuddering, desperate breath that was the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. A second breath followed, then a third, steadier now, and the newborn let out a thin, reedy whinny that pierced the silence of the barn like a bell. Belle, exhausted beyond measure, lifted her head and nickered softly. The first sound of recognition, of motherhood, of life refusing to be extinguished. Dr. Chen, the hardened veterinarian who had seen more equine deaths than she cared to count, sat back on her heels and wept. In 20 years of practice, she had never witnessed a delivery under conditions this extreme result in a live foal. She had never seen a mare so depleted find the strength to push. And she had certainly never seen a child's voice become the difference between life and death. But the revelations were not finished. As Dr. Chen examined Belle more thoroughly in the aftermath of the birth, she discovered something that made her hands tremble. The pregnancy had been a twin conception. At some point early in gestation, one of the embryos had been absorbed, a common occurrence in horses, but one that left telltale signs a trained eye could recognize. Belle had been carrying two foals, and her body, starved and agging, had sacrificed one to preserve the other. The family had not just been starving a pregnant mare. They had been starving a mare fighting a biological battle they could not see, drawing on reserves of strength that should not have existed, surviving long enough to deliver the one foal that remained. And Lily, who knew none of this, who had never been told about embryos or absorption or the brutal mathematics of equine reproduction, had somehow sensed that Belle needed someone to believe in her. The science could not explain it. Dr. Chen would later say that in all her years, she had learned one thing: horses know. And this horse had known that a little girl was coming for her every night. The sky outside the barn had begun to pale. The blizzard was tapering off, and the first gray light of dawn was seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Inside the stall, Belle lay with her newborn filly nursing at her side. The two of them bathed in the warm glow of a heat lamp that Dr. Chen had rigged from the rafters. Lily was asleep in the corner, wrapped in her grandmother's blanket, her face peaceful for the first time in 3 weeks. Tom, Claire, Michael, and Jacob stood in a loose semicircle, their bodies exhausted, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. They had come to this barn expecting to bury a horse. Instead, they had been handed a mirror, and the reflection showed them a truth that none of them were ready to name. It was Claire who finally broke the silence. She looked at her husband, the man who had promised his daughter that Belle would never be sent away, who had broken that promise in a kitchen meeting that took less than 3 minutes, and she said the words that would become the seed of everything that followed. "We owe her an apology, and we owe her more than that." Tom nodded, his jaw tight, and looked at his sons. Michael and Jacob, who had voted to leave the horse to die, could not meet his eyes, but they did not need to. The work of repair was not about words, it was about what they did next. And what they did next would not only save the farm, it would transform it. They started with what was immediately in front of them. Tom spent the next 3 days in the barn, sleeping on a cot beside Belle's stall, rising every 2 hours to check the foal's temperature and help the weakened mare nurse. He did not ask for Lily's forgiveness. He did not try to explain away the kitchen vote with talk of feed prices or frozen water. He simply showed up, the way his daughter had shown up, and let his presence do the work that words could not. Michael and Jacob, who had spent years learning the language of practicality from a father who had forgotten his own heart, began arriving at the barn before school to muck stalls and refill water buckets. They were clumsy at first, uncertain how to hold a mare's halter without flinching, but Lily showed them. She had become, in the span of a single winter, the most knowledgeable horseman in the family, not because anyone had taught her, but because she had paid attention when the rest of them had looked away. Belle's recovery was slow. Dr. Chen visited every other day, tracking the mare's weight and the foal's growth on a chart she taped to the stall door. The filly, whom Lily named Promise, gained strength with each passing week, a dark bay blur of long legs and curiosity who followed her mother through the paddock like a shadow. And Belle herself, who had seemed on the verge of dying for so long that the family had accepted it as inevitable, began to fill out. Her coat regained its luster. Her eyes, which had been hollow with exhaustion, softened into something that looked almost like contentment. Dr. Chen called it a medical anomaly. Lily just called it love. But the transformation did not stop at the barn door. Something had shifted in the architecture of the Mitchell family, a crack in the old foundation that let in fresh air. Claire, who had supported the initial decision to abandon Belle with a heavy but silent heart, found herself unable to look at her husband without seeing the tracks in the snow, the tarp, the mason jar candle. She told Tom that if the farm was truly in such dire straits, then they needed to face it together, not make decisions that haunted them in the dark. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the vote had been cast, and with Michael and Jacob and even Lily present, they opened the books, not to assign blame, but to find a way forward that did not require cruelty disguised as necessity. What they discovered surprised them. The farm was struggling, yes, but not beyond rescue. The bank was willing to restructure the loan if they could show a viable plan. And Tom, for the first time in years, began to imagine a different kind of farm, one that did not just extract from the land and the animals, but gave back, one that honored what Lily had done. The idea crystallized during a conversation with Dr. Chen. She mentioned that there were dozens of old horses in the county whose owners faced the same impossible math the Mitchells had failed. They could not afford veterinary euthanasia. They could not afford winter feed. And so the horses were abandoned or neglected or sold to kill buyers for pennies on the pound. What if, Dr. Chen asked, the Mitchell farm became a place where those horses could come, a sanctuary, not a rescue with glossy brochures and fundraising galas, but something simpler, a promise that no horse would die alone in a frozen field because the math didn't work out. Tom looked at Lily when he heard the idea. She was sitting on the porch steps, Promise's head in her lap, and she was humming a song her grandmother Margaret used to sing. And he knew, with a certainty that had not visited him in years, that this was the answer he had been searching for. The farm would become a refuge for old horses, the ones the world had discarded, the ones nobody wanted to feed, the ones who still had life in them if someone was willing to sit with them in the cold. The community's response was not immediate, but it was profound. Martha Henderson, who ran the general store, organized a hay drive that brought in 40 bales in the first week. George, the neighbor who had once helped Tom haul a trailer in another lifetime, volunteered his truck for transporting rescued horses. A local carpenter offered to rebuild the old shelter in the far field, the same shelter that had been collapsed when Belle was left there free of charge. And James, a young veteran who had been drifting through town looking for work, arrived at the farm and asked if he could help with the daily chores. He had seen a news piece about the girl and her horse on a regional station, and something in the story had made him weep for the first time since he got back from overseas. He never left. Within 6 months, The Mitchell farm had taken in 5 new horses, a blind gelding, a lamanitic pony, 2 senior mares whose owners had passed away, and a yearling with a leg injury that had been deemed too expensive to treat. Each one was given a stall, a blanket, and the same quiet attention that Lily had given Belle in the frozen darkness. Lily became the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador, leading school groups through the barn and telling them, with a 7-year-old's unvarnished honesty, that horses were not machines. They were friends, and friends didn't abandon each other when things got hard. And then came the final surprise, the detail that nobody saw coming, the twist that would have been unbelievable if it were not documented in the papers Tom still keeps in his desk drawer. It arrived in the form of a letter from a breeding registry in Kentucky. Belle, the throwaway mare that Harold had bought for $35 at a county auction, was not an anonymous mutt. Her bloodline traced directly to a legendary foundation sire, a horse so rare and prized that his descendants were tracked across multiple continents. The letter had been triggered when Dr. Chen, out of professional curiosity, had submitted a DNA sample from Promise. The results showed that the filly was one of fewer than 200 living descendants of this particular bloodline worldwide. The foal that had nearly died in the snow was, from a genetic standpoint, worth more than the entire Mitchell farm. Offers began arriving within weeks. Breeders from Texas, from California, from as far away as Germany, wanted to purchase Promise for sums that would have erased the family's debt overnight and secured their future for a generation. Tom brought the offers to the kitchen table, the same table where he had once voted to abandon a dying mare, and laid them out for the family to see. And then he turned to Lily, who was now 8 years old, and asked her what she thought they should do. She did not hesitate. She looked at the papers, at the numbers that would have made any adult's head spin, and she said, "She's not for sale, she's family." And Tom, who had once broken a promise to this same child, folded the papers and put them away. He understood now what he had failed to understand that winter. Some things cannot be priced. Some bonds are not negotiable. The farm would find its way forward not by selling its soul, but by doing the work, one horse at a time, one day at a time. The sanctuary operates to this day. Belle lived to the age of 34, passing peacefully in the same stall where she had delivered Promise, with Lily's hand resting on her forehead. Promise still grazes in the main pasture, now a mare herself, and the far field, the one where a 7-year-old girl once walked through the snow to keep a dying horse company, has been renamed Lily's Meadow. It is where the rescued horses go when they are strong enough to run again. And if you visit on a quiet evening, you might see a young woman walking among them, her hand brushing their shoulders, her voice low and steady, still keeping the promise she made when she was small enough to fit through a window and brave enough to believe that showing up was the only thing that mattered. The story of Lily and Belle does not end with a sanctuary or a saved foal or a family redeemed. It ends with a question that lingers long after the barn lights go out. How many other horses stand in far fields tonight, waiting for someone who will not come? How many other children are lying awake, listening through heating vents to conversations they were never meant to hear, deciding in the dark whether to slip through a window or stay safe in bed? The world is full of creatures deemed too old, too expensive, too inconvenient to keep. And it is full of people who have convinced themselves that mercy is too costly. But every once in a while, a 7-year-old girl reminds us that mercy costs nothing except presence, and that presence is the one currency that cannot be devalued. You do not have to own a farm to understand this. You only have to remember a moment when someone showed up for you when the math said you were not worth the trouble. That is what Belle learned in the cold. That is what Tom learned in the barn. And that is what Lily has kept teaching day after day in a meadow where old horses run young again. If this story stirred something in you, then hold onto that feeling. Let it remind you that the smallest acts of devotion can rewrite entire futures. And if you want to see more stories about the quiet courage that lives in ordinary places, hit subscribe and come back. We will be here, telling the ones that matter.